The morning sun had just started peeking through the narrow streets of Los Angeles. The city was already awake, cars honking, people rushing, a few street performers warming up for the day. In the middle of all this noise and motion, Jason Statham stepped out of his apartment, wearing a simple black hoodie, dark jeans, and a cap pulled low over his face. He wasn't in the mood for fame that day. He had a meeting scheduled later, something about a new film script. But right now, all he wanted was a quiet cup of coffee. No cameras, no questions, just peace. The cafe he chose was small, tucked between a bookstore and a flower shop on a quiet corner. It was one of those cozy spots that locals loved but tourists rarely found. The smell of freshly roasted beans floated through the air as he opened the door. The soft ring of the bell above it welcomed him in. Inside, the place was calm. A few people sat by the window typing on laptops. A couple shared breakfast at a corner table, and the barista behind the counter greeted him with a polite smile. Jason nodded back, speaking in his usual calm tone as he ordered a large black coffee. "Coming right up," the barista said cheerfully. Jason moved to a small table near the wall. He pulled out his phone, scrolled through a few messages, and then set it aside. For once, he wanted to disconnect from everything: the industry, the schedule, the interviews. He leaned back, watching the world through the cafe window. Outside, the streets looked normal. Nothing about that morning hinted that it would become a story people would talk about for years. After a few minutes, his coffee arrived, steaming hot, served in a simple white cup. He thanked the barista, took a small sip, and exhaled slowly. The bitterness and warmth of the drink reminded him of the quiet mornings he rarely got to enjoy anymore. He sat there in silence, just listening. The sound of the espresso machine, the quiet chatter of strangers, the faint music playing in the background. It was all simple, but peaceful. Then the cafe door opened again, and two men walked in. They looked like regular customers at first glance, but there was something about their posture, straight-backed, alert, focused, that stood out. One of them scanned the room quickly before heading to the counter. The other looked toward Jason for a brief moment, then turned away. Jason didn't pay much attention at first. He assumed they were just another pair of guys grabbing a morning drink before work, but the atmosphere seemed to shift slightly. The air felt heavier, quieter, as if something unseen had entered the room. The two men spoke quietly to the barista, showing something on a phone screen. Jason noticed the barista glance in his direction, then quickly look away. That caught his attention. He frowned slightly but said nothing. He took another sip of coffee, pretending not to notice. Moments later, the two men approached his table. "Morning," one of them said. His voice was calm but carried an edge of authority. "Mind if we have a quick word?" Jason looked up, slightly puzzled. "Sure," he replied, setting his cup down. "What's this about?" The man exchanged a quick look with his partner. "We're looking for someone who matches your description," he said. "There's been an incident nearby." Jason raised an eyebrow. "An incident? You think that's me?" "It's just routine," the man said. "You fit what we were told. Dark hoodie, cap, about your build. Mind showing some ID?" Jason stared at them for a second, then let out a quiet sigh. "You're serious?" he asked. "You know who I am, right?" The second man squinted, studying him more closely. Recognition flickered in his eyes for a brief moment, but before he could say anything, the first one leaned forward. "Sir, we just need to confirm your identity," he said, his tone more firm now. "Please cooperate." Jason slowly reached for his wallet, still calm but clearly irritated. He pulled out his ID and handed it over. The man glanced at it quickly, then frowned. "Jason Statham?" he muttered under his breath. Jason gave a small, humorless smile. "That's right. The one from the movies," he said quietly. The man's face softened, but before he could respond, a sound from behind the counter made everyone turn. Another customer had dropped a cup of coffee. And in that split second of distraction, one of the officers, nervous, still gripping his own coffee, accidentally bumped into Jason's table. The steaming cup tipped forward. Before Jason could move, the entire drink spilled across his hoodie, splashing down his chest and arm. The burning heat made him flinch, but he didn't shout. He just froze, blinking in disbelief as the brown liquid dripped down to the floor. The cafe went silent. The barista gasped, "Oh no." The officer stammered, setting his cup down. I'm so sorry. That wasn't... I didn't mean... Jason stood up slowly, his expression unreadable. He looked down at his soaked hoodie, then back at the officer. The room felt heavy, everyone watching to see how he would react. For a man known for explosive fight scenes and tough guy roles, his silence was almost more intimidating than anger. His jaw tightened slightly and his eyes met the officer's. The man stepped back nervously. It was an accident, he repeated. Really? Jason held up a hand, stopping him. His voice came out quiet, calm, but with a cold edge. You know what's funny? He said slowly. Every time something goes wrong, it's always just an accident. He took a napkin from the table and wiped his sleeve, his movements precise and controlled. The barista rushed over with more napkins, mumbling apologies even though she hadn't done anything wrong. It's fine, Jason said softly, taking them. He cleaned his hands and looked back at the two men. You got what you need? The first officer cleared his throat. We might have made a mistake, he admitted. You're not the person we were looking for. Jason nodded once. That's what I thought. He turned slightly, his voice calm but carrying enough weight to be heard across the cafe. Next time, maybe check twice before you spill someone's coffee, especially when it's this hot. There was no anger in his tone, just quiet authority. The kind that made everyone in the room straighten up a little. The officer looked embarrassed. I really am sorry, he said again, his voice low. Jason didn't answer. He just grabbed his jacket from the chair, draped it over his shoulder, and walked toward the counter. The barista looked up, worried, but he gave her a small smile. Can I get another one to go? He asked softly. She nodded quickly. Of course. It's on the house. He thanked her and waited patiently while she made the new cup. Meanwhile, the two officers stood near the door, awkwardly avoiding everyone's gaze. When Jason's drink was ready, he took it, thanked the barista again, and turned to leave. Just before walking out, he stopped in front of the two men. The one who had spilled the coffee looked nervous, unsure what to expect. Jason met his eyes for a moment, then said quietly, You know, in the movies, this is the part where I'd probably do something dramatic. The officer swallowed hard. But this isn't a movie, Jason continued, his voice calm. So maybe just be careful next time. Then he walked out. After the meeting, he went home, changed his clothes, and tried to move on with his day. But the moment kept replaying in his head. The sound of the cup tipping, the burning sting against his skin, the silence that followed. It wasn't the pain that bothered him most. It was how quickly things had turned. He had done nothing wrong. He was sitting quietly, minding his own business. But in a few seconds, he became a suspect in someone else's story. He thought about the look in the officer's eyes. Uncertain, defensive, embarrassed, and how quickly people can lose patience, even when they're supposed to protect and serve. It wasn't anger that Jason felt. It was something deeper, something he couldn't quite name. That night, as the city lights flickered outside his window, Jason sat at his kitchen table, sipping tea and scrolling through his phone. Social media was already buzzing. Someone from the cafe had filmed part of the scene, not the whole thing, just the tense moment when the officers confronted him and spilled the coffee. The video had gone viral within hours. People were shocked at how calm he had stayed. Comments flooded, and only Jason could get burned and still look that cool. Man didn't even raise his voice. That's real power. Respect. That's how you handle it. Jason read the comments silently. He didn't smile, didn't frown, just sat there thinking. He hadn't asked for any of this attention. He just wanted coffee, that's all. But now, it was a story everyone had an opinion on. The next morning, reporters were waiting outside his house. When he stepped out for his morning jog, flashes went off and voices called out his name. Jason, can you tell us what really happened? Were the cops rude to you? Are you planning to take legal action? He shook his head, putting up a hand politely. No comment, he said. His voice was calm but firm. He didn't want to make it worse. He didn't want to turn it into a war of words. But deep inside, he also knew something needed to be said, not for him, but for the people who didn't have cameras watching when things went wrong. A few days later, Jason agreed to do a short interview for a magazine that had been following his work for years. He trusted the writer, someone who wasn't just chasing gossip but cared about real stories. When they met, Jason sat down, took a deep breath, and said quietly, "It wasn't about me getting burned. It was about how fast things can go wrong when people stop seeing each other as human beings." The interviewer leaned forward. "You handled it better than most people would have." "No shouting, no scene." Jason shrugged lightly. Getting angry wouldn't have helped. Those two were already nervous. Sometimes silence teaches a louder lesson than shouting ever could. The article went live the next morning and people loved it. It wasn't dramatic or flashy, just honest. Jason talked about patience, respect, and how power isn't about reacting. It's about staying grounded when others lose control. That message spread fast. It reached people far beyond his fans, even those who didn't know much about him. Teachers quoted it. Parents shared it. Police departments across different states quietly used the story as an example of calm under pressure. But not everyone was quiet. 2 days after the article came out, Jason received a handwritten letter delivered to his home. The handwriting was neat, formal, and careful. He opened it and began reading. It was from the officer who had spilled the coffee. The letter started with an apology. The officer admitted that he had been having a tough week, that his team had been chasing a suspect matching Jason's description, and that in the confusion, nerves got the better of him. He didn't excuse his mistake. He simply said he regretted it deeply and was grateful Jason didn't respond with anger or humiliation. The letter ended with a line that caught Jason's attention. "Your calm response taught me more about professionalism than any training I've had in years." Jason set the letter down and sat quietly for a while. It wasn't the apology that moved him most. It was the honesty in it. People make mistakes. What mattered was what they learned afterward. That night, he decided to stop avoiding the topic. He went live on his social media for the first time in months. He wasn't wearing a fancy outfit or sitting in a studio. Just a plain t-shirt, soft lighting, and his calm, steady voice. "I didn't plan on talking about this," he began, "but I think there's a lesson here. The truth is, it wasn't a big fight. It wasn't a scandal. It was just one of those moments where things went wrong fast. I could have reacted badly, sure, but what good would that do? Everyone has bad days, even cops. What matters is what we take from those moments." He paused, looking straight into the camera. "Anger's easy," he said softly. "But respect, that's the harder choice. It takes more strength to stay calm than to explode." The video lasted only 3 minutes, but it spread like wildfire. Within hours, it was everywhere. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was genuine. People started calling it the calm moment. Clips of his short speech were played on news channels, and celebrities reposted it, praising his message about patience and self-control. One talk show host even said, "If more people handled conflict like that, the world would be a quieter, kinder place." Meanwhile, back at that small cafe, things had changed too. The barista who had served Jason that day decided to frame the napkin he used to wipe the spilled coffee. It wasn't about fame. She said it reminded her of how grace under pressure can change a situation. A few weeks later, Jason stopped by the cafe again. He walked in quietly, just like before. The barista recognized him instantly and smiled. "You came back," she said, sounding a little surprised. "Of course," he replied, returning the smile. "Coffee's still good here." Everyone in the cafe tried not to stare, but whispers spread quietly across the tables. People were careful not to make him uncomfortable. As he waited for his drink, a young man at another table leaned over and said softly, "Hey, I saw your video. Respect, man. You handled that better than I ever could." Jason nodded politely. "Thanks. Sometimes the best revenge is just staying calm." The man laughed quietly. "Guess that's easier said than done." Jason smiled faintly. "True, but worth it." When his coffee was ready, he took it and headed to his old spot by the window. The light streaming through made everything look softer, more peaceful. He looked outside and saw the same busy street, the same traffic, the same endless motion of the city. But now it all felt different somehow. He noticed one small thing. Across the street, near the bookstore, an older man accidentally dropped his bag of groceries. Before Jason could even move, 2 strangers, people who didn't know each other, rushed over to help him. Something about that simple moment made Jason smile. Maybe, he thought, people really were paying attention. Maybe calmness and kindness could ripple out further than he realized. Over the next few weeks, life returned to normal. He went back to work, filming new projects, meeting friends, doing interviews. But the coffee story followed him everywhere. Fans would mention it, reporters would bring it up, and even directors joked about including a coffee scene in his next movie. But Jason always handled it the same way. A polite laugh, a short answer, and then he'd steer the conversation elsewhere. For him, it wasn't about reliving that moment. It was about what it stood for. Then one morning, a few months had passed since the coffee shop incident, but Jason still remembered it clearly. Not because of the embarrassment or the pain from the hot spill, but because of what followed, the calm after the chaos. It was strange how something so small could shift how people looked at him. He was used to attention, of course. Movie premieres, red carpets, action scenes. But this was different. People weren't talking about his films. They were talking about the way he handled real life. Everywhere he went, people brought it up. At restaurants, someone would nod and say, "Respect for the way you stayed calm, mate." In airports, fans would wave and tell him that his reaction inspired them. Even random strangers on the street would stop him just to say, "You made me rethink how I deal with anger." Jason appreciated it, but he didn't let it get to his head. Fame had taught him long ago that stories come and go, but this one seemed to stick. Then one afternoon, his manager called him about something unexpected. "Hey," the voice said through the phone, "I got a message from the police department. They're hosting a community event, kind of a public talk about respect, trust, and dealing with stress. They want you to come and speak." Jason raised an eyebrow. "Me? Talk to cops?" His manager laughed softly. "Yeah, ironic, right? But they said your story made a real impact. They even used that video in one of their training sessions. Thought you might want to share your perspective." He thought for a moment. It wasn't something he'd normally do, but maybe it was worth it. If the whole situation could actually help people think differently, maybe it wasn't such a bad idea after all. "All right," he finally said. "Tell them I'll be there." The event was held a week later in a local community hall, not far from the area where the coffee shop incident happened. The hall was full. Police officers, students, community workers, and even families who had seen the viral video. When Jason arrived, heads turned. But instead of walking straight to the stage, he stopped and greeted people along the way, a small gesture that instantly softened the atmosphere. He didn't have a speech written down. He didn't need one. When it was time for him to speak, he just stood up, took the microphone, and began to talk in his usual calm tone. "Most of you already know about what happened," he said. "It wasn't a big deal at first, just a misunderstanding that went a bit wrong. But the reason we're all here, the reason this story even became a thing, and is because of what came after." He looked around the room, making eye contact with people as he spoke. "I've been in movies where I throw punches, chase villains, crash cars, and jump off buildings. But in real life, the hardest thing I've ever had to do is stay still when I wanted to react." The room was silent. He continued, "When that coffee hit me for a second, my instinct was to get angry. That's natural. But anger never fixes things, it just adds fuel to the fire. So I took a breath. I let it go. And you know what? That choice made more noise than any argument ever could." Some people nodded, others just listened closely. "I'm not here to blame anyone," he said. "The officer made a mistake, and he apologized. We all mess up sometimes. What matters is how we handle the moment after the mistake." He paused, letting that line sink in. Staying calm isn't weakness. It's control. It's strength in silence. And if even one person here remembers that next time things get heated, then it was all worth it. When he finished, the room erupted in applause. People stood clapping not just for what he said, but for what it meant. It wasn't about celebrity or fame. It was about being human. After the event, several officers came up to thank him personally. One of them, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, said quietly, "You changed the way I see this job. It's easy to forget we're human under the uniform." Jason nodded, giving a firm handshake. "That's all I wanted to remind people of," he said simply. As he left the hall, a group of students asked for a quick photo. Before taking it, one of them asked, "What's the best advice you've ever learned about dealing with anger?" Jason smiled faintly and said, "It's like holding a hot cup of coffee. The tighter you grip it, the more it burns. Sometimes you've just got to put it down before it spills." The kids laughed, but they got the message. That evening, Jason sat alone on his balcony, looking out at the city lights. The noise from the day still echoed in his head. The clapping, the questions, the kind words. He wasn't used to being called an example. He had made his career playing tough, fearless characters. But now people were praising him for something far quieter: restraint. He thought about how life had shifted since that morning in the cafe. A single moment of chaos had turned into a ripple of understanding. It was strange, but somehow it felt right. A week later, he got another call. This time from a charity organization that supported young people dealing with anger issues. They wanted him to share his story with some of the teens they worked with. He agreed without hesitation. When he arrived at their small center, the kids were curious but shy. They knew who he was, of course, the action star who always stayed cool under pressure. But they didn't expect him to be so down to earth. He sat on a chair among them, not in front of them, and said, "I've had my share of bad days too. But what I learned is that losing your temper doesn't make things better. It makes them harder." One teenager raised his hand and said, "But what if someone disrespects you?" "You're just supposed to let it go?" Jason smiled slightly. "Letting it go doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're smart enough not to waste your energy on something that doesn't deserve it." The boy nodded, thoughtful. Another kid spoke up, "But how do you stay calm in the moment?" Jason took a deep breath and said, "You don't have to be perfect. You just have to pause. That 1 second, that pause, can save you from doing something you'll regret later." I've seen people lose everything because they reacted too fast. Sometimes the best move is no move at all. The room went quiet again. His words weren't fancy, but they hit home. After the talk, one of the organizers came over with a grateful smile. "You've done more for these kids in one afternoon than most programs do in weeks," she said. Jason didn't say much, just nodded, shook her hand, and thanked her for the work she was doing. That night, as he walked back to it, was early one morning when Jason received an unexpected call. He'd just finished his morning workout and his manager's name flashed up on his phone. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, picked up the phone, and answered with a tired voice. "Hey, what's up?" "Jason, you're not going to believe this," his manager said, sounding a little out of breath. "The mayor's office wants to meet with you. They're holding a community outreach event and they want you to be their keynote speaker." Jason leaned against the door frame, squinting at the bright sunlight streaming through his window. "Wait, the mayor? Why me?" His manager chuckled. "It's about the whole coffee incident. People are calling it the calm moment. They want you to talk about it, share your perspective on how you handled the situation, and why it matters in a world where people act without thinking." Jason paused. He hadn't thought about the coffee spill in months. After the initial media storm, he'd done his part to share a positive message, but he hadn't expected it to go this far. "Why not?" he finally said with a shrug. "What do I have to lose?" The event was scheduled for the following weekend, and Jason agreed to attend. The mayor's office had arranged for him to speak to a crowd of local residents, law enforcement officers, and some community leaders. It was a chance to reflect on his role in the unexpected story that had unfolded. A few days before the event, Jason found himself standing in front of a mirror, adjusting his shirt. He wasn't nervous, but he did feel an odd sense of responsibility. He had never thought of himself as a role model, especially not after a small accident. But now, here he was, being asked to stand in front of an audience to talk about something as simple as staying calm in the face of adversity. The day of the event, the venue was buzzing with anticipation. The hall was packed, and there was a feeling of excitement in the air. As he arrived, he could feel the stares. This wasn't like the typical movie premiere or a red carpet event. This was something entirely different. It felt less like a performance and more like a personal reflection. When Jason took the stage, the audience fell silent. He wasn't wearing a suit or trying to look like a typical public figure. Instead, he wore a simple black shirt and jeans as if he was just another person in the crowd. That was the point, after all. He wasn't here to deliver a speech from a script. He was here to speak from experience. "Thank you," he began, his voice calm but steady. "I'm sure you're all wondering why I'm here. After all, I'm just a guy who spilled coffee on himself in a cafe. It's not exactly something to put on a resume." A few people chuckled. He could see that the tension in the room had eased a little. "Here's the thing," Jason continued. "That moment could have gone in 1,000 different directions. But it didn't. I stayed calm. I didn't scream or shout. I didn't cause a scene. And why? Because sometimes the best response is to take a step back and think before you act. The audience was hanging on every word. They were used to seeing him on the big screen playing tough characters in high-stakes situations, but here he was just being himself. No stunts, no special effects. It was raw, honest, and powerful. I'm sure most of you have had moments like that where someone cuts you off in traffic, or someone says something that really rubs you the wrong way. Your first instinct is to retaliate, to fight back, to make sure you're heard. But here's what I've learned. It doesn't have to be that way. You don't have to react to every little thing. He paused, letting the message sink in. Then he added, it's about control. It's about making a choice. When you stay calm, you create space for a better outcome. You have the power to decide how the story unfolds. Jason looked around the room, his eyes meeting those of the officers, the parents, and the young people sitting in the front row. I've learned that anger doesn't make you stronger. It makes you weaker. The more you hold on to that anger, the more it holds on to you. And that's not strength. That's giving up control. His words resonated with the audience. They were simple, but they cut deep. Jason wasn't telling them how to live their lives or pretending he had all the answers. He was just sharing what he'd learned from his own experience. After his talk, people approached him one by one. Some offered words of thanks. Others simply nodded as if they understood exactly what he meant. A police officer, clearly moved by his words, pulled him aside. I can't tell you how much this means, the officer said, his voice thick with emotion. It's easy to forget what we're supposed to stand for when the job gets tough. But hearing you say that, about staying calm and being in control, it reminded me why I became an officer in the first place. Jason nodded, placing a hand on the officer's shoulder. You've got a tough job. But the fact that you're reflecting on it means you're already on the right track. The event ended with a round of applause, and Jason felt a strange sense of fulfillment. It wasn't about the applause or the praise. It was about the idea that his simple message, to stay calm, to think before reacting, was actually making a difference. A week later, Jason received a letter from the mayor's office. It wasn't just a thank you note. It was an invitation to participate in a new initiative Design months had passed since the incident in the cafe. For Jason, life had returned to its normal rhythm: early mornings, workouts, film schedules, and the occasional interview. But the memory of that day never left him. Not because it had been dramatic, but because of what had followed. The spill, the tension, and the awkward silence had transformed into something bigger than he ever expected. It started with small gestures. Fans would come up to him on the streets not to ask for an autograph, but to tell him how his calmness inspired them to handle their own stressful moments differently. Drivers on the road would nod when they spotted him. Even people who had never seen his movies knew the story. The story of how he had stayed calm when most would have reacted with anger. One morning, Jason received a call from the cafe owner. She sounded excited, almost giddy. Jason, you won't believe this, she said. The cafe is hosting a small gathering next week, and we want you to come. People want to hear your story in person. Jason leaned back in his chair, a smile tugging at his lips. A gathering? Really? Yes. Just a few regular customers, some neighbors, a little event to share positive stories. We thought it would be nice for you to talk about how you handled everything. He agreed without hesitation. It wasn't a big crowd, but that was the point. Small gatherings had a way of connecting with people in a way large events couldn't. On the day of the gathering, Jason arrived early. The cafe had been decorated simply. A few chairs arranged around a small stage, some flowers on the counter, and a warm, welcoming atmosphere. The barista waved him in and he smiled back. Good to see you again, she said. You too, Jason replied, glancing around the familiar space. It was comforting to be back, even under slightly unusual circumstances. As people trickled in, Jason noticed familiar faces. Some were regulars from the cafe, some were neighbors who had heard about the story, and a few were just curious visitors who wanted to see him in person. The room buzzed softly with anticipation. When it was time to begin, Jason took the small microphone and smiled. I'm glad to be here, he said quietly. I know this story started with something small, a spilled cup of coffee. But sometimes, small moments can teach us the biggest lessons. He paused, letting his words settle. The audience listened intently, hanging on each sentence. I've played characters who fight, chase, and survive impossible situations on screen, he continued. But in real life, one of the hardest moments I've ever faced was staying calm when someone spilled hot coffee on me. It was simple, ordinary, and yet it became something that taught me a lot about patience and choice. A few people chuckled softly, appreciating his honesty. Jason didn't try to make it dramatic or funny. He simply shared what had happened and how he reacted. "It's easy to lose control," he said. "It's easy to react out of anger, fear, or frustration. But those moments don't define you. How you respond does. That's the real power. That's the part that matters." As he spoke, he noticed a young woman in the front row nodding. She had her arms crossed, looking thoughtful, and Jason caught her eyes for a brief moment. He smiled at her and she smiled back. It was a small connection, but it reminded him why sharing these stories mattered. After the talk, the cafe owner invited everyone to ask questions. One of the regular customers, an older man with graying hair, raised his hand. "Jason," he said, "how did you manage to stay calm when the coffee spilled?" "I don't think I could have done that." Jason leaned forward, resting his hands on his knees. "Honestly," he said, "I thought about reacting at first. But then I realized, what good would it do? The coffee was spilled, the situation was awkward, and getting angry wouldn't fix anything. I chose to stay calm, and that choice made all the difference." Another attendee, a young man in his 20s, spoke up. "Do you think people react angrily because they feel powerless?" Jason nodded. "Sometimes. We all feel powerless in different situations. But staying calm isn't about pretending you're in control. It's about actually taking control of your response, even if everything around you feels chaotic. It's not easy, but it's worth it." The questions kept coming, each one thoughtful and reflective. Jason answered them all with the same calm, measured tone, making each person feel heard. By the end of the gathering, there was a sense of connection in the room, not because of fame, but because of understanding. Afterward, people came up to shake his hand or offer thanks. Some shared their own stories of times when staying calm had helped them, and Jason listened quietly, genuinely interested. As he packed up to leave, the barista handed him a small cup of coffee. "On the house," she said. "And maybe a little extra caution this time." Jason laughed softly. "Thanks. I'll take it slow." Walking out of the cafe, he felt a warmth that had nothing to do with coffee. It was the satisfaction of knowing that a simple story, a story that began with a mistake, had created something meaningful. The next week, Jason returned to his film set. The incident had long been behind him, but the ripple effects continued. The crew teased him jokingly about the coffee incident, but everyone respected the way he had handled it. He didn't mind the jokes. In fact, he found them amusing. During breaks, he often reflected on how the incident had changed his perspective. Fame was fleeting. Recognition could be shallow. But moments of human connection, moments where people learned and grew, were lasting. One afternoon, while reviewing a script, Jason received another letter. This one was from a young boy who had watched the viral video and read about the lessons Jason had shared. The letter was simple. "Dear Mr. Statham, I saw the video about the coffee. My dad loses his temper a lot and it scares me. After seeing you stay calm, I tried it too. The next time my dad got angry, I stayed calm and helped him talk it out. Thank you for showing me it's possible." Jason smiled as he read it. He had never met the boy, yet he felt a connection through the words. A small act, a small choice. It had traveled farther than he could have imagined. Later that week, he met with the same officer who had spilled the coffee. This time, there was no awkwardness, no tension, just mutual respect. "Jason," the officer said, shaking his hand, "I wanted to tell you that your story has changed more than my career. It's changed how I approach life. I've started mentoring younger officers, teaching them patience and control before they even face a tough situation. I even show them your video as an example." Jason nodded, quietly pleased. "I didn't expect that," he said softly. The officer smiled. "Neither did I, but it happened, and it's made all the difference." As he walked away from the meeting, Jason reflected on the chain of events. A spilled cup of coffee, a tense moment, a choice to stay calm, and suddenly lives were changing. The ripple effect of one simple act had become greater than he could have imagined. Weeks later, he returned to the cafe once more. This time he didn't speak publicly. He just sat sipping his coffee, listening to the quiet chatter around him. Regulars smiled and waved. some even quietly sharing their own small stories about patience and calmness. Jason realized that the real victory wasn't in being right or in proving a point. It was in showing that calmness, respect, and thoughtful action could create change, the kind of change that moved quietly but powerfully. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow across the cafe, Jason took his last sip and smiled. Life, he thought, had a strange way of turning accidents into lessons, chaos into growth, and mistakes into opportunities. The spilled coffee, once a moment of embarrassment, had become a story of human resilience. It wasn't about revenge, fame, or attention. It was about the simple, profound truth that staying calm, even in the face of frustration, could make all the difference in the world. Jason stood, waved to the cafe owner and staff, and walked out. Outside, the city carried on as usual. Cars honked, people rushed by, and life went on. But for Jason, nothing would ever feel quite ordinary again. That one moment, small and fleeting, had taught him a lesson he would carry forever. That real strength often speaks in silence, and that true impact comes from choices, not actions. As he disappeared into the evening, the warmth of the coffee lingered not in his hands, but in his heart. Ned to help improve community police relations. The program was based on the principles of respect, communication, and emotional control. They wanted Jason to be involved as a spokesperson, using his story as a powerful example of how staying calm in tense situations could change lives. It felt surreal. Jason never imagined that a small accident, one that had caused him a little discomfort and a lot of unwanted attention, would turn into something this meaningful. But that was the beauty of life, he realized. You never knew when a seemingly small moment would have a far-reaching impact. As the months passed, Jason continued to speak at various events, sharing his message with schools, police departments, and even corporate organizations. His story was more than just about spilled coffee. It was about human nature, about the ability to choose how to respond to the world around you. The media continued to cover his talks, sharing clips of his speeches on social media. What had started as a viral video became a movement. People began discussing how they could apply the lessons of patience and emotional control in their own lives. In schools, teachers used Jason's story as part of their curriculum to teach students how to manage anger and make better decisions. But Jason didn't let the attention go to his head. He wasn't trying to become a motivational speaker. He wasn't even sure if he deserved all the praise. He simply felt that if his story could help even one person, it was worth it. Then, one day, as he was wrapping up another event, Jason received a letter that stopped him in his tracks. It was from the officer who had spilled the coffee all those months ago. The letter wasn't an apology. It was something much more profound. The officer explained that after the incident, he had begun reflecting on his own approach to law enforcement. He had started a program within his department that focused on de-escalation techniques, emotional intelligence, and community engagement. The officer had even used Jason's story in training sessions, explaining how staying calm could prevent dangerous situations from escalating. The letter ended with a simple sentence. I wanted to let you know that you changed my life, and I'm working to make sure it changes others too. Jason sat there reading the letter over and over. He wasn't sure how to feel. He never intended for his actions to have such a ripple effect. He didn't want credit for what had happened. But as he thought about the officer's words, something inside him shifted. Maybe, just maybe, this was his real legacy. Not the movies, not the fame, but the quiet moments, the ones where people chose to be better, to do better, and to treat each other with respect. As Jason sat back in his chair, looking out the window, he couldn't help but smile. The story wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. And if his story could change even one person's life, then all of it, the spilled coffee, the awkward moment, the unexpected consequences, had been worth it. His car, he realized something important. Maybe this was why that strange moment in the cafe had happened, not by accident, but to teach him something he could pass on. Life had a way of using unexpected moments to shape people. Months passed, but the story still popped up online from time to time. Some new video edit or post would circulate and people would comment again, still impressed by how calm he'd been. But Jason had moved on, until one day he received a letter that caught him off guard. It was from the same officer, the one who had spilled the coffee, The letter was short but heartfelt. It said that he had been promoted recently and had started a small training session for new recruits focused on patience, respect, and communication. He had named the session the Calm Cup. Jason chuckled softly when he read that part. But as he finished the letter, he felt a genuine sense of pride. The officer had learned something valuable, and now he was passing it forward. That was the best kind of revenge. Jason thought, not anger or bitterness, but change. The next morning, Jason went for a quiet walk near the beach. It was early,